Well, a very good afternoon to everybody, and thank you very much indeed for being with us today for this, our third BRT UK lunchtime masterclass, in which we switch from general discussions, as we've been having the last 2 weeks, and focus on a very distinct and precise area of interest, namely the issue of 24-hour bus lanes in London. I'm really delighted to welcome John Haynes from Transport for London to tell us about them. But before we get on with that, I must make a few introductory remarks. Remember, this is strictly a lunchtime session, so we will be ending promptly by 1:30. We really do encourage you, our audience, to participate by using the chat function. If you'd like to pose a question for our speaker, please do so. But can you do it succinctly and in as few words as possible? And we will do our level best to try and address everything. Inevitably, we don't get to answer all the questions, but we'll do what we can. I'm James Freeman, and I'll be chairing today's session again. I have time to do so, I suppose, because I retired from my post as Managing Director of First West of England back in March. I may be retired, but I am still very much involved in the buses and remain passionate about it all. So partly because earlier this year I became chair of BRT UK, which of course has been around for 15 years and is about sharing and spreading what's good in buses generally and bus rapid transit in particular. In the time before we can get back to running our annual conference, which before COVID was really the highlight of each year for us at BRT UK, we decided to lay on these masterclasses with technical support from Landor conferences. We are, though, aiming to run a conference in the coming year, and we've set aside the 16th, 17th of March 2022 to be on Merseyside. So please pencil those dates into your diary if you'd like to be part of that. Now, coming back to today, our first two speakers in the series, of course, were David Leader and Leon Daniels talking in the round. But today we meet John Haynes from TfL. John's role is as lead sponsor at TfL, where he's worked for the past 12 years. And he has been playing a leading role in shaping the capital's cycling revolution. More recently, though, he has switched his focus and he's currently responsible for delivering TfL's Bus Priority Programme to improve bus journey times across the capital. So we're going to hand over to him in just a second or two. It's worth saying this is being recorded, by the way, so that people can watch it in their own time. And it's interesting that lots of people have been doing that with the previous two of these lunchtime masterclasses. So, John, enough of the preliminaries. It's my very great pleasure to welcome you as our lunchtime masterclass speaker this Thursday. So over to you.
Thank you very much, James. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, indeed.
Fantastic. I've made my sacrifice to the team's gods and hoping that for the next hour or so, the connection will continue. Thank you very much for inviting us. Before I get started, I'll just give apologies because this was advertised as a double act between myself and Giuliano, my colleague at TfL, who's been involved in the project. Unfortunately, he can't be here today. So you are stuck with just me. I will do my very best to talk about a project that we started last year, which was to change the operating hours of all of the bus lanes on the Transport for London road network to operate at all times, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's, as James said, it's less of a think piece discussion today and a bit more of a nuts and bolts examination of delivering the project, what we had to do, how we've done it, and what we've been looking at over the past year. And certainly in terms of being a masterclass, I wouldn't class myself as a master, especially compared to some of the very illustrious guests. David and Leon in particular gave fantastic talks over the last couple of weeks. So if anyone hasn't signed up for the future talks, do that because they look really interesting. But any discussions around bus contracting models or electrification, I'll put my hand up right now to say that I'm not actually involved in the day-to-day running of London's buses. So a lot of those topics go hand in hand with a very loud swooshing sound as they go straight over my head. As James said, and as is on the slide, I'm a sponsor at Transport for London, which often people don't quite understand what a sponsor is. It's a growing profession. I think it's becoming more established in some industries, but I think it is still quite confusing. My family, not least, think that I sell advertising space on the tube, or I'm trying to convince the banks to create Barclays buses and they'll all go blue instead of red. It's nothing to do with that. Another way of describing it that's a bit easier to understand is acting as the client for a project, the internal client. That role gets interpreted in many different ways. It's primarily focused on the funding, the business case, the approvals, the governance, but also things like stakeholder management and various other activities. It can often be a jack of all trades type role, and it dabbles sometimes in project management, sometimes in transport planning, strategic thinking, sometimes as a public spokesman, which is probably why I'm here today to talk about this project. And so Giuliano and I have been sponsoring this project for the last year or so. And so hopefully we can give you a bit of information as to what's been going on. So if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to cut the session into 3 chunks. Firstly, talking about why the project came to be, how we then delivered it last year, before pausing for some questions. And then in the second part, we'll talk about some of the monitoring activities, some of the benefits realization work that we've been looking at, before more questions. And then finally, a section on lessons that have been learned. And there are lots of lessons, and that's probably the most useful element and takeaway point from this discussion. So hopefully that will be useful. Move on to the next slide. And again, thank you. So I won't go into all the details about transport in London. Most people on the call probably get lots of information about TfL and how travel in London works. There's a huge transport offer. I think that's well known, but the tube, the Docklands Light Railway, we've got a growing cycle network, and of course we've got the bus network itself. Transport for London is the strategic integrated transport authority for London. We manage the tube, we manage the bus network and all 9,000 odd buses, and we are governed by the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and in particular the Mayor's transport strategy. And a really fundamental point of that strategy is to achieve 80% of journeys being made by sustainable modes by 2041. This has been part of TfL's core strategy for a number of years now, even before the pandemic. It's a really ambitious target, and will be delivered through a variety of different modes of transport within London, and the bus network will play its part. And it has to play a huge part. In fact, in terms of mode share, the bus network in London already transports huge numbers of people. I think before the pandemic, it was around 6 million, something like that a day. The main point is that in order to achieve that, we need to grow patronage on the bus network by 40%. So if you consider how many people were using the bus network pre-pandemic, growing that by another 40% to achieve that 2041 target is huge. The bus network has to play a really important role. And when David was on a couple of weeks ago, he was very clear about the role of bus speeds in affecting bus patronage. And he was very clear that actually declining bus speeds has played a very significant role in declining numbers on the bus network. And from a personal perspective, I don't disagree with that at all. There are lots of factors that influence patronage on the bus network, whether it's the experience of passengers, either at the stop, on the bus, or the rise of other offers such as on-demand travel and active travel. But journey times always comes back as the strongest element. And we know this to be the strongest element, A, because customers tell us that that's the case. Speed always clearly comes out as the #1 reason for catching the bus. And also we can actively plot that in terms of patronage versus speed, and we can see a very clear correlation. That's not to say that all the other factors aren't important. So improving the experience on the bus, improving the experience at the stops are all important. And over the next few weeks, TfL should be publishing a bus action plan that's going to outline its strategy for the years to come. And within that, journey times is going to be a really key piece. In terms of the network itself, if we could move on to the next slide, there are about 290 kilometres of bus lanes across London. It doesn't cover the whole of where buses go for various reasons, but including that you can't always fit bus lanes into some of London's very narrow roads. But when we look at the network and understand which are our most strategic roads, about 70% of the where the bus network is doesn't have a bus lane. And that's really important in terms of speeds, because one of the main objectives is to give buses priority over private car. There's lots of debate and discussion about sort of cycling versus buses and other forms of traffic, but ultimately it is private car it is the main factor that we are looking at in terms of where we need to provide priority to the bus network. So in terms of those 290 kilometres, about 125 are on the Transport for London road network. And as strategic authority for London, we manage 5% of the most strategic roads in London, carries about 30% of the traffic. And across all of that, we have 125 kilometres of bus lanes. About that, I say about because we don't always have a very clear picture of where we have bus lanes. The network is constantly changing. Bus lanes are being added, bus lanes are being removed for various reasons, or temporarily moved because there's construction works and so on. But we're about 125 kilometres. But I think the important thing is over recent years, we have seen an overall trend in declining numbers. And certainly one of the things that we need to do is grow that, particularly in outer and inner London, where there's huge opportunity to improve bus speeds across London. So in terms of bus lanes, I'm not going to talk about sort of lengths of bus lanes, increasing number. What I've been asked to talk about today is actually the hours in which they operate and what drove the project that we started last year to go 24/7. These two graphs are quite helpful, even though they are not particularly easy to see, especially on my screen. But they represent the number of buses in operation and the number of passengers on the bus network pre-pandemic. Obviously, that has massively affected the data that we have. But pre-pandemic, we were already seeing quite a trend in that most bus lanes have traditionally operated at historical peak times, 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. But what we were seeing in terms of the overall picture in London is that there's a sharp increase from as early as 4 a.m. in terms of the number of people and the number of buses on the network. And even as late as 9 o'clock, we're still seeing quite significant numbers. And analysing a range of trips, I think we analysed something like 1.5 million trips worth of data to understand what this meant was that actually bus speeds are already declining well before 7 a.m. when those bus lanes were starting, and they weren't stabilizing until much later into the evening. And so even before the pandemic, we were already looking at the bus lanes going what we consider to be traditional peaks is starting to spread, both in general traffic terms, but also how it impacts upon the bus network itself. So if we move on to the next slide. So the pandemic brought this into much sharper focus. Obviously, we had lockdown, and we had a lot of advice around changing travel patterns and changing the timing in which people do travel. Last year, Transport for London launched the Streetscape for London programme, which was in response to the pandemic, promoting active travel and to provide space on the network for social distancing, and supporting the bus network was really important within that. Huge numbers of people still needed to catch the bus, especially with things like the night tube being suspended. One of the things that we were very keen to do was to look at making sure that we didn't have people spending unnecessary amount of time on the bus because of delays to travel, unreliability, and also bunching at the stops themselves. So having a really efficient, clean moving system was helping play a role in social distancing. And you can see there that it was both a short-term objective, but also something that we were looking at in the longer term. It was already stated in the MTS, Mayor's Transport Strategy, that we were going to look at the hours of operation, working with the boroughs who control the rest of the road network in London. So if we move on to the next slide. So last year, we took the action to change the bus lanes that were in our control to 24/7. A large proportion are on the borough road network. That's not part of our control, so it's not part of the trial. This is only on the Transport for London road network, and it equated to about 85 kilometres of bus lanes in total. There are a few bus lanes on the TLRN that weren't included for very specific reasons, but most have now moved to 24/7. So if I give an example of why some haven't converted, there are some bus lanes where you are travelling on the borough road network, driving along happily, and then it becomes TfL's road network. And so having mismatching rules on those particular bus lanes, many people in London find the rules difficult enough. So I think people would be quite unhappy to get fined for not understanding that you've moved from one part of one person's network to another. So there are quite specific reasons why we didn't convert every single bus lane, but the majority are now there. We didn't change anything in terms of who's allowed to access bus lanes. Taxis are allowed, motorcyclists, bicycles. None of that was affected, and that was a key question that came up through some of our early engagement. We looked at curbside activity. There's a huge range of curbside activity on the Transport for London road network and within bus lanes themselves. We made the decision that we were going to suspend parking bays within bus lanes that were having an impact on the operation of the bus network. But we did not suspend any loading bays or any disabled bays, and we did not change any of the red route controls, those red lines that you see on the road. So all of that was unaffected. The end result, as you'll see in later slides, is that by maintaining a lot of that curbside activity, that has meant that there are still cars in the bus lanes parked for very good reasons, for very legal reasons, and that will have an impact on bus journey times. But given the position that we were in last year, where we were in lockdown, surveying usage of loading bays where some of those businesses weren't operating at that particular moment, we would never have been able to found a position that actually supported those requirements. So that was why we made that set of decisions. But it's, I think, probably overall weakened the output that we would have otherwise got, but for understandable reasons. So if we move on to the next slide. We introduced the trial as an experimental traffic order, which is unknown to a lot of people. It's become a bit more prominent over the last year because it's been used to introduce a variety of pandemic response schemes on the network, particularly things like low traffic neighborhoods and things like that. One of the good things about an experimental traffic order is that it's very much a trial. It's flexible, you can change it, and it can last from 6 months to 18 months, and it allows you to really monitor what changes you've introduced and respond accordingly. It does mean that you do less activity up front, whereas traditionally at TfL we may take several years of analysis, stakeholder engagement to deliver a scheme on site. You can actually get out on site much quicker. You might use temporary, cheaper materials, but it is a lot more work during the process because a lot of the consultation activities are baked into the trial being live. And we knew throughout the whole process that there were going to be some locations where we might have unforeseen consequences, and we wanted the ability to adjust the trial, make changes as we went along. And so an ETO was the process that we decided to go with, and it has pros and it has cons at the same time. One of the things that we did try and do is enhance what is the statutory processes for an ETO. You have to consult with certain organisations and go through certain processes, but we wanted to engage with a much broader audience, make people aware of the trial before it happened, but also introduce a range of active listening throughout the course of the trial so that we could really get some really useful feedback from people. So there's a range of activities that we've done. There's a number of organisations listed there, but that's definitely not the full range of people and stakeholder groups that we've engaged throughout the process. But we did try and do our very best to publicise it.
Great.
We move on to the next slide. This is some of the response that we got at the time. It's interesting. I mean, headlines are always punchy and not focusing on the details, but when it says things like ban to cars, actually that's not true at all. There are still many cars in bus lanes because we did not suspend all of that curbside activity, and it was just as easy to park overnight as it was before. But there's really positive response, as well as some concerns about what this might have on the performance of general traffic and what the suspension of parking meant as well. I'm still trying to get my head around why the change was going to facilitate additional burglaries. If anyone can work that out on the chat, I'd be very interested to understand that. That was a bit of a curveball, but that's sort of why we have introduced the trial, and a very quick rundown of how we've done it. I'll pause there because there are probably lots of questions related to that.
John, thank you very much indeed. As you've stimulated quite an interesting chat on the side there. A lot of it around the issue of priority between the various competing cars, cyclists, buses, taxis, all these sorts of things, and how on earth we're going to balance that. I suppose, I mean, we could have a whole conversation about that, but in a way that's not what today is about. And in some ways the conversations are answering each other. But one specific question that's just come in is from Dominic West, who asked, so what are the enforcement hours for bus lanes, as they don't appear to be being enforced 24/7, although they exist 24/7?
That's a good question. So the enforcement hours are something that we've been fairly fluid with throughout the course of the trial, because the rules relating to the network are often misunderstood. And one of the things that we saw very early on in the trial was a lot of people getting in contact saying, I can't do this and I can't do that. And we had to write back and say, actually, you can. You just haven't quite understood the rules. Which is understandable. The rules are very complicated. Even I struggle, and I've been working on this project for well over a year now. In terms of enforcement, we've deliberately sort of taken a balanced view in terms of how to go about that. And it, with such a broad policy across London, we've been looking at individual sites. So that is actually one of the lessons learned that I'll come on to, is that you would think that it would be the bus teams that we have at TfL, the ones actually running the bus network, that would be our closest form of contact for a project team delivering this. But it's our teams that are dealing with enforcement, where we have to spend more time on a regular basis.
And who are they, John?
Specific locations.
Who are they?
Sorry. Well, we have a specific team at TfL who look after enforcement on our network. TfL being such a huge organisation, we have a team for everything, obviously, and so they've been a very helpful
Good.
team.
Right, John, I'm looking at the clock and realising it's almost 1 o'clock. We've only got about 25 minutes left, so we better get on to part 2. Over to you.
Okay, so as I said, a lot of the activities is sort of baked into the overall duration of the trial, and one of the key things for us is monitoring its success. And so we've looked at this in a range of different ways. Obviously, bus journey times, very important. One of the things that we wanted to check was that we weren't having a significant impact upon the operation of the network and how traffic moves generally. Not necessarily just to protect cars and boxes like that, but also we have a huge range of freight movement. We have lots of reasons as to why we need to make sure that the network operates on a daily basis. In terms of other impacts, there were factors that we were interested in, although we didn't believe that there was going to be conclusive evidence that this was going to have a meaningful impact. So bus lanes where there isn't dedicated infrastructure is a really good facility for cyclists. Did we expect that cycling numbers were going to shoot up in London massively because of the hours of bus lanes? No, we didn't, but we wanted to monitor it anyway. Air quality, again, very interesting to see that, but did we expect London's air quality to suddenly improve overnight because of the trial? No, we didn't. And there are so many background factors as well that it's very difficult to do that. Safety was an important other impact, because one of the real hard tests for us is not making the network safer. Not making the network less safe. It's quite an important distinction. And so when we first started the trial, what we didn't want to see was sort of rat running, leading to more collisions or more incidents on the network. So we wanted to make that a really important part of our monitoring process, to be able to look at those incidents and respond and change. And fortunately, spoiler alert, we haven't ever had to take reactive action where we've seen a problem materialise. And then finally, stakeholder feedback. A lot of people focus on this as a data exercise in terms of how buses operate, how traffic operate, but actually the stakeholder element is the most significant part of it. It's all about the localities, the communities, and that curbside activity, because that's one of the biggest factors in this project. So we've looked at all of those things, and in terms of stakeholder engagement, we've tried to do a lot of different things, whether it's London-wide surveys with bus operators, bus drivers, getting the local feedback from the public. We've tried to get a whole range of views, and I'll step through a couple of the activities of how we've gone about this. So if we move on to the next slide. In terms of journey times, this is actually quite a difficult one in terms of how best to do this, because obviously the pandemic has had a massive influence on how the network has operated and how bus journey times have felt. So we've had to think quite carefully about how to analyse the data. We split London into 3 separate zones, which are quite clearly distinct and shown in the map there. And then what we've done in order to help distinguish between what might be influence of the pandemic versus the trial is compare and contrast our trial bus lanes with control bus lanes that were already 24/7 and therefore didn't change. The other thing that we've tried to do is compartmentalize the timings, because that's fundamental to the trial. And it's really important to make sure that we disaggregate results where the bus lanes were already in operation, because we did see massive changes in some of those bus lanes, but they were in the times that the bus lanes already operated, so it's actually skewing results. And we needed to make sure that we were actually talking about the changed hours rather than the old hours. The bottom left-hand graph is actually a really hard working graph. It doesn't tell you any meaningful data because it is one step in part of analysis, but it helps show why this is quite a complicated part. So if we click through it, so down in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got central London, and then to the right of that, we've got inner and outer. And then you can see that we've got the light blue of the control and then the dark blue of the trial. And what we're seeing here in the graphs is trying to compare that trial with the control, because trying to compare 2021 data with 2019 data was never going to be a meaningful result. So if we click again, the top left there shows that the trial has improved bus journey times compared to the control. So one might conclude that that is a great result, but you'd need to then disaggregate it from previous hours of operation, and you'd also need to investigate, are there other things going on with the network? So that's not necessarily a conclusive result. If we move on to the next one again, this one shows actually the trial has performed worse than the control. Not a great result. What I would say is that I happen to know that particular one, and once you disaggregate the previous hours of operation, it's not a problem. So that's why it's really important to think up front about how you're going to analyze the data itself. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we've got the trial performing worse than 2019 and the controls performing better. That's a calamitous result. That's entirely what we don't want to see. But again, investigating that in detail has been quite interesting to see what's actually been driving that change. So the bus data itself is very, very complicated, and trying to draw out high-level conclusions is very, very difficult. It all comes down to individual bus lanes. We move on. So stakeholders, I said this is a huge part of the traffic order. We've done surveys with Londoners in general, generally in favour of the trial, both as a temporary measure, but also as a permanent measure. And we've also asked them for feedback on the signs themselves, just out of interest, because there's a lot of discussion about what is the best way of communicating this. It quite clearly came out that at all times was the one that made most sense to people in terms of what you can and can't do in terms of bus lanes. So those global surveys are quite helpful. But on top of that, if we move on to the next slide, what we've been trying to do is get really detailed understanding. So we created a survey that people were able to submit to, and we've had almost 1,000 responses to that, and we've been analysing that as we go through. I would say that it's less favourable in this part of the stakeholder feedback than that at that global level, because that's generally come from local issues where people have got concerns. It's generally been from residents or from drivers of private vehicles. And it generally comes down to two issues, which we did expect, which is that general traffic journey times were going to get worse, and that suspension of parking bays was going to have an impact upon people. Once we've looked at that throughout the course of the trial, we've actually been able to narrow that down to a small number of locations where it's particularly problematic, and that drove about 70% of all the responses that we got. And so it wasn't necessarily that it is terrible across the board. It's actually just a few locations where if we'd have had more time up front, we might have been able to sort of see those issues, take corrective action. But what the benefit of the experimental traffic order is that we were then able to change that during the trial. And we actually made a lot of changes within the first few months. And you can see, you'd expect survey results to be high at the beginning to go down, but we do see it come, really drop off a cliff after we've done something about those parking bays. And generally, the reasons for us were around protected characteristics through our quality impact assessment, manual handling, particularly for businesses, and lack of viable alternatives. So we had some very clear ideas of how we were going to assess that, rather than people saying, I want parking, I want it back. We move on. And that's about it in terms of monitoring. There's huge amounts in there, and I've tried to condense it, but very happy to take questions on how we've gone about that before moving on to the lessons learned.
Yeah, it's interesting that the conversation in the chat is going around a number of associated topics, one of which is the issue of in areas where there aren't so many buses, has the thought that HGVs might use bus lanes ever crossed TfL's mind, to your awareness?
I think it's a really interesting topic, and it's something that we are looking at in terms of who gets access to bus lanes. A number of vehicles can already access bus lanes, and there are lots of organisations that also want access. And we've had a number of conversations with emergency services recently, because there is a distinction between when emergency services are on blue lights versus when they're potentially returning from an incident, or patient transport, in terms of moving people between hospitals for appointments and things like that. Those are really quite important issues. But equally, if you allow every organisation, everyone access to the bus lanes, then the level of priority starts to reduce. So it's quite a complicated topic, and I know that some of my colleagues are looking at this at the moment and potentially exploring some further trials. So it'd be interesting to see what comes out of that.
Okay, switching our approach a little bit, Gareth Davis asks, the decision to change the TMOs for hours of operation at a borough level is a political one. There's a need to balance the needs of the local community versus people who travel through the corridor. The borough officers need an evidence base to help them make the positive case for bus lanes versus the complaints of one or two shopkeepers. Are you going to present an information pack that the boroughs can use to produce specific evidence for their routes, John?
I was hoping that they'd all be on this call and this would do the job. No. Yes, I think the simple answer is yes. This has to be a first step. In London, the borough road network actually is hugely important in terms of how the bus network operates, and we need to provide support to our borough partners, and the borough partners need to help us. It's a really important relationship that we do, and so I think one of the outputs of this will be sharing this information, helping create the case, and then also kind of showing lessons learned about how to go about it. Because we know that a number of boroughs are interested in changing their hours of operation. Some have already done it. Last year, I think Hounslow and Ealing already changed their hours, but it's about helping them get through what is inevitable backlash, because every scheme, every policy change has some element of backlash, and it's being able to respond to that's so important.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Matt Gamble, is there any evidence from bus reliability, such as changes in excess wait times on particular bus routes?
We're still going through all of the analysis at the moment. Reliability is a difficult one, although I think actually reliability is a really important case with priority in general, especially when we're trying to squeeze every bit of impetus out of the bus lanes, because when we're adding bus lanes, one of the things that we've looked at is small stretches may not have a huge impact upon bus speed, but in terms of the reliability to events, that's quite important. I think the trouble that we've got is trying to disaggregate changes that were just happening over the last year versus changes from the trial is already quite a tough job, and I'm not sure whether we'll be able to draw too many conclusions. I think at the moment the sense is that we think that the trial has had an overall benefit for bus speeds. I don't think we've got a suggestion that we've sort of brought London to a standstill. I think we would have known about that last year. There might be one or two areas where we need to look in a bit of detail. Surprisingly, air quality hasn't suddenly made a change as a result of the trial, although pandemic, less travel obviously had a view. Cycling numbers in general have gone up in London, which has been really positive as a result of a lot of the work from the London Streetscape Programme, but also general kind of behaviour change through the pandemic. But again, I don't think I can claim credit for that with the hours of operation. I might give it a try, but probably won't succeed. And safety, I don't think we've created any safety problems. If anything, the limited data, and you've got to take safety data with a pinch of salt, because we generally take years worth and validate it, analyze it, and compare it. But so far, the limited data that we do have suggests that potentially the number of collisions have reduced. So that's a positive indication.
Good.
Sorry, James.
We better get on. We better get on. I think that time is fighting us again.
Okay. So lessons learned. I've cut this into two sections. Firstly, about changing bus lane hours, and then secondly, around traffic orders. So in terms of changing bus lane hours, data. It was a massive problem for us in that we've had to fix a lot of TfL's databases as we go along, because some of TfL's databases didn't line up with what was the traffic orders said, and the traffic orders didn't line up with what was on site. And so it was a very difficult picture for everyone involved in the project, trying to work out what was right and what was wrong. So getting that right is so important, especially if you want to analyze the data later, and making the ability to have the data identify where there are other issues, because we were very fortunate that all of our other street-based programs have been flagged in terms of analysis, so that we have the ability to go, let's take all of that out of the analysis process so that we're not skewing results. And so the more data you can get up front, the better. And tagging it is really important. It's been a lot of effort to get right, but getting it right up front means that we've seen two different scenarios. For our delivery team, when we ask, where's X, Y, and Z, how many signs have we got, this kind of information, it's a difficult answer, because it was a difficult process this time last year, whereas the analysts that have been developing the data, they spent a long time cleansing the data and getting the data right, which was very frustrating when all we wanted was results. But as a result, every time we ask them a new question, they're able to very quickly change the analysis, because all the tagging is in place. So I'd really recommend spending the time to get that right. And then curbside activity, that's fundamental to bus lanes and the hours that they operate. Determining what to change, how to assess it was a really important factor. And then also explaining it as well, because as I said, we got a lot of confused people that thought we were banning a lot of things that we weren't banning. So that's really a key part of it, and goes back to Gareth's question earlier. In terms of the next slide and lessons learned from an experimental traffic orders, they're really good. I think they have a place. I've used them before the pandemic, and I think we've seen many more since the pandemic. They mean less effort up front, but they are very intensive throughout. And I think that is something to consider in terms of how much resource is required for a project such as that. You need to consider the temporary nature of a trial. It is temporary. It could get removed as the ultimate decision of whether we keep this trial or not. At the time, we therefore decided we use temporary materials. We had stickers onto the existing signs. Unfortunately, some of our stickers were not sticky enough. And so that picture there is showing one of our stickers that is slowly becoming unstuck, and then eventually fell off. And that was a great pain and frustration. We've ended up having to actually replace the sign completely, because the stickiness of the stickers was not sticky enough. And sometimes it is worthwhile doing things in permanent materials, even though it might be temporary. It was a good cost saving at the time, but potentially not so much. But you have to think about the communications with that, because if people think that you're putting something permanent in, then they believe that you've already made the decision. So that's definitely something to think about. Having a monitoring strategy, very, very important. I think we're in a good position because we already had a very clear position last year what we expected, how we were going to analyse it, and what we were going to do with that information. So I think that is really, really something to get right at the outset, so that you have ways to be able to say, this isn't working and we need to change it. And that did allow us to make some of those changes. And there are other schemes that have been introduced over the last year where they've been removed because that, you know, they didn't adhere to the criteria that was set out at the beginning. And then finally, I would say this, because I said that being a sponsor was all about advocacy, is active listening and advocacy. You know, being an advocate for the project, but also advocacy for the local communities. And I think that's been something that has been really important throughout the project. We've had people involved in the project that have been speaking on behalf of those people in the communities who have said, this is a problem, and investigating, going, this is a problem. We shouldn't just stick to this because this was the original plan. We must be flexible. And I think being able to make the voice of the public heard through all the activities that we've tried to do has been a really important part of that. So those are my lessons so far. We obviously haven't made the decision yet. We're still crunching the data, but the signs are looking good so far. And hopefully we'll have a decision soon before the trial expires.
Which is when, as a matter of interest?
So the experimental traffic order expires in March. I think we would like to make the decision much earlier than that, because if we were to remove it or to make changes, then there's a lead-in time with our contractors. So I think we'll be well in advance of that timescale, but that's effectively when the barriers close shut on the ETO.
Good. Excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. There is a lot of interesting material in that for people to take away. It's interesting that any conversation about bus lanes, whether 24/7 or whatever, in London particularly, starts a debate about buses versus cars, which is pretty straightforward, versus bicycles, perhaps not quite so straightforward, and all of that. We could have a big discussion about that, but in a way, that's not what this is about today. What this is about is focusing on a particular angle of the development of bus lanes and how one goes about making bus lanes work and relevant. But do you have any comment to offer in terms of that? You've spent a lot of your career working on cycling, so you must know a lot about that, and you can see the conversation is very much about, well, if bus speeds are actually not prospering, what's the answer?
Everyone wants a silver bullet. I think it's a complex answer, and it has to be done in a number of ways. I think it shouldn't be putting bus versus cycle as the conflict. It very much is about sustainable travel overall. A huge number of cyclists are bus passengers and vice versa, and bus travel includes a huge amount of walking as well. So it's actually trying to compartmentalize is quite unhelpful. The difficulty we've got is road space and how to make best use of that. We do need dedicated infrastructure to grow cycling. But equally, if we do cycling and nothing else, then we will never hit the targets in London that we want to achieve. We have to grow all of those things, in all ways. I think location is important. For the bus network, a lot of where our future market is going to be is outside of central London. It's going to be inner and outer London, and that's something to get heads around, because often the bus network is seen as this iconic thing, and it's not an aspirational thing as a result. Iconic and aspirational don't always go hand in hand. And I think cycling has become quite aspirational, and I think we need to learn some lessons there in terms of getting people to want to catch the bus. And that comes into some of the other measures, and in particular, making it a green choice. What you do with road space, I think the main thing is don't make buses perceived as traffic. They're not traffic, they're traffic busters. They are hugely efficient. And when we create more pleasant streets for cycling and walking, there are ways of including bus travel in that. But I don't think there's a one size fits all, unfortunately. It will be down to location. So yeah, it's not.
So is it not the fact that the problem at the end of the day is the increase in road traffic, i.e. cars, vans, vehicles, and where we're getting ourselves in a bit of a knot as an industry sometimes, buses versus cyclists versus whatever, is that if you give space, take buses space and use it for cycling, which has been done in certain places, the thing that we have to do, and the politicians find so difficult, is to deal with the cars. And actually the cars are the problem. And it seems to me that the problem with some of this is that when it gets to the really difficult bit, which is dealing with the motoring lobby, that is where we all have a problem, and our politicians find it difficult to lead, in all fairness, and that's really the nub of the problem. Just something by the by, incidentally, which is that somebody asked, John Remington asked, the sort of arrival of the electric car charging point, is that going to have an issue around bus lanes? Are people going to want these along the line of routes, or can we keep them off them?
There are so many more policies to come in terms of bus lanes. I think it will. I can foresee a mixed blend, or if I got my crystal ball out, although you'd probably be best asking some of your other speakers, because they're far more well versed on topics like this. But I think private sort of electric vehicles, I can see some locations where that's going to be quite tricky. I think personally, if I had complete rule, I'd really want to protect bus lanes from further parking. And even with
for whatever reason,
if it's charging, yes, that's a very good reason, but there are other ways of managing that, I think. I think that the thing that I'm struggling to get my head around is less about that and more about autonomous vehicles, because if you have a fully electric, green, autonomous vehicle that doesn't require driving, where does the bus fit in that? And I think that's you can make buses have comfy seats, Wi-Fi, aircon, but what benefits do you generate there compared to some of those other things? Now, whilst we may not see private autonomous vehicles anytime soon, but sort of organizations in the same way that we saw on-demand travel, that's certainly something for the future to consider. Not that I'm an expert on that, I'm afraid.
That is a bit of a scary place to end, in a way, isn't it? Anyway, I think we've got to that point of the day when we could carry on, but we have to stop because lunchtime is getting towards its end and we need to think about what we're going to do this afternoon. So I'm going to take the opportunity now really to wrap up the proceedings. And John, I must start by saying thank you very much indeed for taking us through the 24/7 bus lanes exercise with great care and showing us the way. So a huge thanks to you, John, for a most illuminating session. And thanks to everybody else for coming on and registering in your large numbers, and for your interest and for all your comments and questions. Again, the chat has been the source of considerable useful discussion back and forth, some of which we've picked up and some we haven't. But the program is recorded and will be available through Landor LINKS, so you can come back and look at it afterwards, and lots of people will watch afterwards. In terms of thank yous, I'd also like to thank the team at Landor LINKS. Juliana, Mark and Daryl are behind the scenes and help to make these programs work. Just a reminder that the Landor team too is supporting our upcoming conference, which we're hoping to have in Liverpool next March. The dates proposed, as I said earlier, are 16th and 17th of March 2022. So if you're interested, please do keep those days free in your diaries and watch for more details closer to the time. So we're halfway through our autumn series of 6 lunchtime masterclasses. And there are 3 more to come on Thursday at 12:30 every week through November. Now, we've swapped the next two presentations around. We do that occasionally to suit our speakers, who are, of course, generously giving their time for free. So next week's speaker will be Alex Hornby, CEO of Transdev Blazefield in the north of England. Alex's focus is our customers, and in his talk, Buses People Want to Be Seen On, he'll be seeking to show how critical it is to use everything we do as bus operators, not least our buses, to make the buses the mode of choice, not necessity. So, John, thank you again for your super address today. And to all of you, our audience, thank you very much. This is James Freeman from BRT UK, wishing you a great week until we meet again. Goodbye.